Thanks for joining us tonight. Let's start on superannuation. Two very different perspectives on this today. Labor and plenty of others say this is a massive cave-in, a capitulation to the Conservative flank of the party by Scott Morrison and Malcolm Turnbull. Others will say, look, this is pragmatism. This is how you get things done. You have to consult, you have to give a bit of ground, but look at what the final package is going to deliver, and it will deliver. Some wind back of the tax breaks at the top and some budget repair. What do you think about the outcome here on what's been a very vexed issue within the coalition for months now?
Well, both of those points are right, David. It does represent a backflip. It does represent a change of policy by the government. But it does, in that process, represent some progress towards getting some very modest curbs on some of the excesses of the superannuation system and trying to both make it a little fairer and return a little bit to the budget deficit. So they're both right. The government tries to minimise the extent of the backflip. Well, you know, they would, wouldn't they? The coalition tries to maximise the extent of the backflip. Well, they would, wouldn't they? It's modest progress. The scale of the thing, though, is very modest. So we're talking about $6 billion over the forward estimates. And, well, actually, we're talking about if we put together the $6 billion omnibus bill plus the superannuation, we're coming. What's the figure? It's about $11 billion. Is that what the government's talking about?
Yeah. Well, the super package though does see several billion pumped back in with low income goodies and other things, catch up contribution concessions and so on. So I think the net save on the super package is only around 3. So put them together, you'd probably end up with 9 or 10.
Okay. So let's be generous and say it's $10 billion. That's over the forward estimates in a period in which the federal government will be spending almost $2 trillion. So $10 billion out of $2 trillion is close to trivial, David, I'd suggest. But
it's more progress than we've seen for a while, Peter, isn't it?
But this is the point. This is the point. The real import of this is not the scale of it. The real import of this is it's a demonstration that the Parliament, as to quote Morrison from today, the Parliament can work, the two parties can operate, there can be some bipartisanship in the national interest, and they can agree. Now, that's symbolically huge, even if it's, in dollar terms, verging on trivial.
Just on super, though, in a policy sense, Turnbull made the point well, I thought, today, that Labor did nothing on this, on at least the tax breaks at the top, for the 6 years it was in government. Now something's going to be done if they get it through the Parliament. I think they will. And this was put in place, don't forget, by John Howard and Peter Costello. It's been untouchable for a long time. Do you suspect this could be the start, that over the next few years, decade or so, we are going to see those generous perks reined in a lot further than what's been announced today?
Well, it should be, because we're going to find that those very, as you put it, very generous perks that were imagined and entrenched at a time when the mining boom was approaching its peak, and when Australia was really at the peak of its terms of trade, and therefore the budget gushers were in full flow. They will need to be trimmed back, and we're going to also find a series of years where budget revenues are going to be, the forecasts are going to have to be cut back. So we're going to find the budget searching year after year for more savings. So this is a very generous area where governments do need to look for further savings. But the political pain that the government's own base and its own right wing have inflicted on it, and the reversals that they've forced on the government, mean that this government is going to be very delicate, very tender. And this process has been a tenderising one for the government in going back to look at further savings. So
well, that's a good point. I don't expect they're going to rush to go any further on super anytime soon.
That's right. Morrison won't go back next. Well, he won't go back to draw more water from this well next budget, I suspect.
It's interesting too, in a policy sense. Yes, we need generous rules to encourage people to save for their retirement, not rely on the pension where possible. But when you look at what's happened since we've had the system in place, there hasn't been a huge change in the number of people who aren't, in the proportion, the percentage who aren't relying on the pension. Maybe that'll happen over time as more people are able to save more for their retirement. Anyway, let's look at the politics of this, Peter, because as you point out, there's the super deal, there's the omnibus savings deal as well this week. We also saw the gay marriage plebiscite at least introduced to Parliament. I don't think that's going to get through the Parliament because Labor will oppose it. But at least within the coalition's ranks, that is now a settled issue as well. They've worked out how it should work, when it should happen, and whether there should be funding, all these things that were quite contentious within the coalition itself. That's been settled as well. So when you look at this week, so many people have written off this parliament, nothing will get done and so on. At least there's some positives there for Malcolm Turnbull politically.
Well, the positives are, first, that he's been able to keep party unity in settling all these matters. On the plebiscite on same-sex marriage, he's lost one of his senators, he's lost Dean Smith, but otherwise the party's pretty much held together. However, it's done it on the terms dictated by the Conservative faction of the party. That's the first thing, and that makes Malcolm Turnbull essentially the executive officer for a Conservative policy set that was largely initially created and is by Tony Abbott and is now sustained by the Conservative elements of the party. That's the first point. The second point is that although Turnbull will get credit and the government will get the benefit of these savings to the budget, and rightly so, and this is important, this is serious-minded, it shows some seriousness of purpose that the government can get this done, full credit. However, the electorate is going to consider that to be normal functioning government. This is what they're elected to do, this is what the public expects. What the public is really going to be disappointed about is the plebiscite. This is promised policy, which is not going to get through the parliament, and Turnbull's going to have to wear that.
Mm. And so what happens then? I mean, this is the unknown. Malcolm Turnbull was asked again about it this week. What if the plebiscite doesn't get through parliament? What will happen on this issue of gay marriage? We've seen other senior figures in the government ask this as well. What happens if the plebiscite doesn't get through? Because Bill Shorten is going to be, we're told, advising the Labor caucus to block this, to vote against it. The Greens are going to vote against it. The Nick Xenophon team's going to vote against it. So it's pretty clear it's not going to get through. But does Malcolm Turnbull then allow a private member's bill in Parliament to go forward and a conscience vote of government MPs on this, or is that just too politically dangerous for him in this term?
Well, he's said it will be a dead letter. He said he's going to just forget about it. This is the position he's taking, that Labor either has to agree to it on his terms and do the plebiscite, or forget it. This is the position. However, what he's not taking into account is Shorten's ability to continue to campaign on this issue, to say that the Prime Minister isn't respecting the will of the people, that we need a parliamentary vote, and to keep the pressure on. So if that happens and Turnbull finds the pressure irresistible, then something like a private member's bill is an escape valve that he could use. But we are not there yet, and Turnbull's current position is simply to write it off and say, well, Labor has cost you this option, and that's a lost opportunity. But he's going to find that hard to sustain because Shorten will keep this pressure on.
Yeah, he sure will. Look, Malcolm Turnbull leaves, if not tomorrow, then Saturday for New York and Washington for the UN General Assembly and other meetings in the United States. Now, while he's there, we're, just less than 2 months out from the presidential election, do you think the Prime Minister should be reaching out and trying to have a meeting or at least have a conversation with the two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump?
Yes, he should. Normally, a Prime Minister visiting the US during a presidential election campaign wouldn't expect to. He would try to get a phone call for a few minutes to observe a diplomatic nicety, but that would be about it. I would suggest that at the moment, Trump represents such a huge potential disruptive factor for not just the US and the world system, but for Australia in particular, that Turnbull should be making a particular effort to speak to Trump, to basically educate him in the role of the US in the world and the Asia-Pacific and the regional order for stability and prosperity, and try to educate him. And that may sound a little patronising, but Trump has no background in strategic affairs, foreign policy, and probably doesn't understand, from what his pronouncements have been so far, on the alliance system in the Asia-Pacific, where he's threatened to walk away from the US post-war alliance with Japan, walk away from the US alliance with South Korea, to withdraw US forward deployment of troops in both those countries, and effectively hand over control of the region to Chinese ambition. This is such a big risk, such a big point of potential disruption that Turnbull really should be making an effort to seek a meeting with Trump and to educate him about the real equities and the stakes involved.
And that may well be going on behind closed doors. We don't know what efforts are being made to reach out for such.
We know that Julia Bishop has got meetings with some of the senior people in both the Clinton campaign and the Trump campaign, although not the candidates themselves. We don't know yet whether Turnbull's going to be able to get any high-level access. But as you say, in my view, he certainly should be trying.
Oh, yeah, it certainly can't hurt. Now, look, final one, Pauline Hanson. The speech had a lot of familiarity to it last night. When you think back to the maiden speech she gave 20 years ago, in many ways a carbon copy, change Asians for Muslims. And look, the reaction, though, has been quite different, I thought, today, particularly from the government. They're not tearing their hair out, panicking about how to respond. They seem to be fairly disciplined in shrugging their shoulders, saying, we disagree, but she has a right to say it, and we're not going to jump up and down or throw the papers in the air. What have you made about how the government's responded to it, and what Pauline Hanson had to say as well?
Well, as you say, it's standard stuff from Pauline Hanson, so no shock there. Everything she said is consistent with the party platform they took to the election. So there's absolutely no surprise. It's the standard stuff of using division, ethnic, racial and religious division to seek political advantage. The test is whether it's going to be as effective in Australia as it's been for Trump in the US, for Nigel Farage in the UK on Brexit, for the Alternative for Germany party in Germany, for Marine Le Pen, National Front in France. So far, it's not. So far, Hanson has only 4% of the primary vote in the Senate for her party. So the question is whether she can use this parliament to parlay that 4% into something larger, as they have been able, the far-right parties have been able to do in all those other countries. The government, by not overreacting, by being quite calm, giving a firm rejection, repudiation of her position, but not giving her the satisfaction and the validation of a sort of an extravagant response, by not giving her that power, has, I think, as you're suggesting in your question, got it about right. And Labor similarly, they've rejected her, repudiated her, but they haven't turned over the entire day to her, and they haven't given her the benefit of any extravagance in terms of rhetoric.
Yeah, they're leaving that to the Greens, it would seem, at the moment. We'll see how long that lasts. Peter Hartcher, good to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for that. We'll catch you next week.
Pleasure, David.